At 6:14 a.m. on September 17, 1944, on the Coral Ridgeline above the Umer Pocket, Private First Class Jesse Tallbear lay flat behind a limestone outcrop with a homemade bow across his knees and a Japanese pillbox 80 yards downslope refusing to die. He was not supposed to be carrying a bow. He was supposed to be carrying a flamethrower, and it was supposed to be working. It wasn't. The M22 strapped to his back had failed for the third time that week. Its ignition wheel fouled with volcanic dust, its fuel mixture too thin for the tropical humidity. 2 men from his platoon were already dead trying to close that same distance with rifles and grenades against interlocking fields of fire. A third was screaming somewhere below the ridge, and nobody could reach him. Tallbear had a coil of dry rag, a canteen of gasoline, and a bow he had carved himself from a mangrove branch 3 weeks earlier, back when it was still a joke. 8 targets waited in the caves and pillboxes ahead. He had 8 arrows. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, every one of those 8 targets would be burning, and a technique the U.S. Army had no name for would already be spreading through the lines faster than any order could stop it. Jesse Tallbear grew up 40 miles outside Tahlequah, Oklahoma, on land his Cherokee grandfather had farmed since before statehood. His father ran a small forge, shoeing horses and mending plow blades for anyone who could pay in cash, eggs, or nothing at all. Money was thin. Meat was not, because Jesse hunted from the time he could walk, and by 12 he was making his own bows from Osage orange and hickory, the same way his grandfather had taught him. It was not a hobby treated with reverence in his household. It was survival. A missed shot meant a lean week. By the time he enlisted in early 1943, Jesse could put an arrow through a moving rabbit at 30 yards without thinking about it, and he understood wood grain, tension, and burn temperature the way other men understood engines. None of that mattered to the United States Army, which assigned him to a flamethrower team because he was broad-shouldered and steady under pressure, not because anyone asked what he already knew how to do. He shipped out of San Diego in June of 1943, part of a replacement draft headed for the 1st Marine Division, and he carried almost nothing personal with him except a folding knife that had belonged to his grandfather, and a habit of watching wind through grass the way other men watched a clock. Training instructors noted, without much curiosity, that Tallbear scored unusually high on any exercise involving range estimation, wind reading, or timing under pressure. Nobody connected those scores to a boyhood spent tracking deer through post oak timber with nothing but a hand-carved bow and a willingness to go hungry if he missed. The Army saw a strong back and steady hands and assigned him accordingly. It had no category on any form for a man who understood fire, wood, and distance the way his father understood iron. The flamethrower doctrine of 1944 looked clean on paper. Close to 30 yards. Trigger a 3-second burst. Burn the position out. In practice, the M22 was a temperamental piece of equipment that had never been designed for the climate it was fighting in. Humidity above 90%, which was most days on Peleliu, thickened the fuel mixture and fouled the ignition system. Official after-action reports from the 1st Marine Division would later note failure rates on flamethrower ignition running as high as 1 in 3 during the Peleliu campaign, though exact figures varied unit to unit. Jesse watched that failure rate become faces. Corporal Anthony Rizzo went first on September 12th, 5 days before the Ridge. Rizzo was from a fishing family outside New Bedford, quick with a joke, terrified of nothing except letting his squad down. He advanced on a bunker with his flamethrower primed, pulled the trigger at 22 yards, and got nothing but a hiss and a sputter. The Japanese gunner inside did not hesitate. Rizzo went down before he could retreat 6 steps. 9 days earlier, it had been Private Carl Novick, a Nebraska farm boy who could set a fence line straighter than anyone in the company, cut down crossing open ground with an unlit tank on his back because the igniter wheel had jammed with grit. And 2 weeks before that, Lance Corporal Eddie Larson, a Minnesota logger who used to talk about the lakes back home like they were a person he missed, died the same way, in the same kind of ravine, against the same kind of dug-in position that no amount of rifle fire alone could crack. Then came Private First Class Anders Hansen, barely 19, a Wisconsin dairy hand who still wrote his mother twice a week no matter how bad the fighting got. Hansen's igniter fouled at 19 yards from a cave mouth on September 14th, close enough that the men behind him heard the click of a weapon that should have roared and didn't. He didn't come back either. 4 men. 4 names Jesse Tallbear had eaten beside, joked with, carried gear for. 4 deaths from the same broken link in the chain, and nobody above battalion level seemed in a hurry to fix it. The math was worse than any one death. Casualty estimates for Peleliu's assault troops ran close to 60% across the campaign, and flamethrower teams, tasked with the deadliest close-range work against cave systems, absorbed a disproportionate share of it. Officers knew the equipment was unreliable. Replacement parts were scarce, hauled forward under fire like everything else on that island, and there was no time in combat to strip and re-clean an ignition system between assaults. Company clerks kept informal tallies of ignition failures the way other units tallied ammunition expenditure. And by mid-September, the number for Jesse's company alone had climbed past a dozen documented misfires in under 3 weeks of fighting. Jesse kept his frustration to himself the way soldiers do, but it was building, layer on layer. Every time he watched a man walk forward with a weapon that might not work and a machine gun waiting that always would. The root of it crystallized for Jesse on the evening of September 15th, 2 days before the Ridge, while he stripped down his own flamethrower for the 4th time that week and found the same fouled igniter wheel that had killed Rizzo. The problem was not courage. The problem was not tactics. The problem was a mechanical ignition system that could not survive the environment it was being used in, paired with a doctrine that required men to close to nearly point-blank range and trust it anyway. The M22's ignition system worked by sparking a small wheel against a flint to light the fuel stream as it left the nozzle, a mechanism borrowed almost unchanged from a cigarette lighter and never redesigned for jungle humidity, volcanic dust, or the corrosive salt air of an island invasion. Every grain of coral grit that worked into that wheel was one more chance it would fail exactly when a man's life depended on it not failing. He raised the issue with Staff Sergeant Wallace Pritchard, a career NCO who had fought through Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester and had very little patience left for improvisation. Jesse suggested, carefully, that they needed some way to deliver fire at a distance the ignition system couldn't sabotage. Pritchard's answer was short. You want fire on target, you clean your igniter and you get close enough to use it right. That's the weapon we've got, Tallbear. Command isn't shipping us new ones this week. It was not an unreasonable answer. It was also not going to save the next man who walked forward with a machine that hissed instead of burned. The trigger came 2 nights later, not from a friend's death but from something smaller and stranger. Jesse was on watch near the supply dump when he noticed a crate of signal flares, the kind used for marking positions at night, and beside it a coil of rag used for cleaning weapons. He picked up both without really deciding to, turned them over in his hands, and thought about wind drift and burn time the way he used to think about a deer's stride before he loosed an arrow. That night he could not sleep. He lay in his foxhole listening to distant mortar fire, and thought about the bow he had carved from mangrove wood back on Guadalcanal, mostly as a way to pass idle hours, mostly as something the other men had laughed at. He thought about the 80, 90, even 100-yard gaps his platoon had to close under fire before a flamethrower could even reach effective range. An arrow did not care about humidity. An arrow did not have an igniter wheel to foul. By 2 a.m. he was outside his tent in the dark, gasoline canteen in one hand, rag in the other, working by feel because a match would have brought half the company down on him with questions he did not yet have good answers for. He thought, too, about the distances involved. Standard flamethrower doctrine required men to close inside 30 yards, often inside 20, against positions that could see them coming from 150. That gap, the space between where the enemy could kill you and where your own weapon could reach back, was where Rizzo, Novick, Larson, and Hansen had all died. An arrow closed that gap without asking a man to walk into it. That single realization, turned over twice in the dark, was the whole idea in miniature. Everything after that was just craftsmanship. The modification, if it could even be called that, took most of 2 nights to perfect. Jesse worked in the hour before dawn and the hour after dusk, when the light was too poor for anyone to notice details, and too early for officers to be making rounds. He cut strips of cotton rag into 6-inch lengths and bound them just behind each arrowhead with thin wire scavenged from a communications spool, tight enough that they would not slip loose in flight, but loose enough to hold saturated fuel. He experimented with ratios of gasoline to a thickened jelly he mixed from crushed ration crackers and grease, chasing something closer to napalm consistency than raw fuel, which burned too fast and too unevenly off bare cloth. His hands smelled of gasoline for 2 straight days. He tested draw weight against wind drift on a stretch of open ground behind the supply lines, adjusting fletching angle until an arrow held true past 100 yards. He clocked burn time with a stopwatch borrowed from the medic, timing how long a soaked rag stayed lit against how long it took to reach a target at various ranges, discarding mixtures that guttered out too early or flared too violently on the draw. He understood with total clarity what he was risking. Unauthorized modification of ordnance, improvising incendiary weapons outside issued equipment, deploying an untested device in a combat zone without command approval. Any one of those was grounds for a court-martial, and Jesse Tallbear had grown up poor enough to know exactly what a dishonorable discharge would cost a Cherokee farm family with nothing else to fall back on. There was a night, the second one, crouched behind a supply tent with fuel-soaked cloth drying stiff around 8 arrowheads, when he almost stopped. He thought about Pritchard's flat refusal. He thought about regulations he had never read but understood instinctively existed. Then he thought about Carl Novik's fence-straight furrows and Eddie Larson talking about lakes he would never see again, and he kept working. No one else knew what he had built. Not his foxhole partner, not Pritchard, not the lieutenant. By the time gray light broke over the ridgeline on the morning of September 17th, 8 fire arrows sat wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his pack, and Jesse Tallbear had told exactly nobody. The platoon moved out at 5:40 a.m. under orders to clear the ridge position that had stalled 2 previous assaults. Jesse carried his flamethrower as issued, freshly stripped and cleaned, alongside his rifle, and the bow slung quietly across his back where it drew no more attention than it ever had. Nobody asked about the bow anymore. It had become part of the landscape of him, the same way Rizzo's harmonica or Novik's crumpled photograph of Nebraska had been part of them. He watched the deployment unfold from a shallow, defilade 100 yards out. 2 fire teams pushed forward on the flanks while a third held center, exactly as briefed, exactly as it had gone the 2 times before when the position held and men died for no ground gained. Nobody in the platoon knew what was in Jesse's pack. Nobody had any reason to expect anything different from this attempt than the last 2. The night before, Jesse had lain awake running through burn times in his head the way he used to run through shot placement before a hunt. 60 seconds of fuel-soaked cloth burning against 30 seconds of arrow flight at maximum range left almost no margin for a bad wind reading. He had checked his fletching twice by feel in the dark. He had checked the wire bindings a 3rd time after that, worried one might work loose under the vibration of the draw. Lieutenant Roy Calhoun, briefing the platoon at first light, laid out the assault plan without any reference to incendiary arrows, because as far as command knew, no such thing existed. Jesse said nothing during the briefing. He simply nodded when asked if his flamethrower was serviced and ready, which technically it was. The humidity that morning sat somewhere close to 95%, thick enough to feel on the skin before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. DeLuca, walking point on the flame team, joked quietly that the tank on his back felt heavier every day they spent on this island. Jesse didn't laugh. He was watching the cave line ahead, counting shadows, doing math nobody else in the platoon knew he was doing. At 6:04 a.m. the point man on the left flank triggered the first burst of enemy fire. A Nambu machine gun opening up from a cave mouth Jesse could just make out through the haze of morning humidity. The radio crackled. Contact, cave position, 11 o'clock 100 yards. Hold what you've got, do not advance, wait for flame teams. Standard doctrine. Pin them, bring flame forward, burn them out. Except the nearest flame team was Jesse's own flamethrower man, Corporal Wallace DeLuca, and DeLuca was already pinned flat behind rock, 60 yards short of effective range, with Nambu rounds chipping limestone 6 inches over his head. Lieutenant Calhoun's voice came over the radio again, tighter now. DeLuca, can you get flame on that position or not? Negative, I'm pinned. 60 yards short, no clean angle. Hold position, we'll bring up mortars. Mortars would take 10 minutes to range in, if they came at all on ground this broken, and Jesse had watched enough men die in the gap between a call for support and its arrival to know 10 minutes was not a number anyone on that slope could afford. That was the moment Jesse Tallbear stopped thinking like a flamethrower assistant and started thinking like a hunter. He moved to DeLuca's position under covering fire, dropped his flamethrower tank against the rock, and pulled the bow off his back. DeLuca stared at him like he had lost his mind. "Tallbear, what in hell?" "Cover me, don't ask." The first target was the Nambu position, 80 yards out, dead center in a cave mouth barely 2 feet high. Jesse struck a match cupped inside his palm, touched it to the first fuel-soaked arrowhead, and drew the bow in one motion. The arrow arced low and fast, trailing a ribbon of flame and black smoke. It struck the cave mouth and burst against the rock in a spray of burning fuel that poured inward on the draft. The Nambu gun went silent inside 4 seconds. "Cave 1 down," Jesse said, already knocking the second arrow. Behind him, radio chatter turned confused. "Say again, what fired that? We didn't call flame." He did not answer. There was no time. A second position, 62 yards to the right, opened up in support of the first, rounds kicking dirt a foot from his boots. He lit the second arrow off the smoldering remains of the first, drew, released. It struck low, splashing burning fuel across the firing slit. Screaming followed, then silence. 2 down. DeLuca had stopped asking questions and started calling ranges instead, spotting for him like he'd been doing it for years. Third position, 140 yards, upper ridge, tucked behind that boulder. 140 yards was farther than any test shot Jesse had made in daylight. He adjusted his draw, accounted for a crosswind coming off the ridge, and loosed the third arrow high, watching it arc and drop directly onto the boulder's firing position. Fuel ignited across exposed brush and timber bracing the cave mouth, and the position went quiet inside 10 seconds. Third position, confirmed burning. A fourth position opened up almost immediately after the third went dark. A machine gun team shifting fire from a collapsed emplacement 40 yards to the left. Rounds stitching across the rock face close enough that DeLuca ducked instinctively, even though the fire wasn't aimed at him yet. Jesse lit the fourth arrow off a smoldering scrap of cloth still burning near his boot, drew, held half a second longer than the others to account for the crosswind gusting harder now off the exposed ridge top, and released. The arrow struck the emplacement's firing slit dead center. Fuel bloomed inward. The gun went silent inside 6 seconds. 4 down. Fifth position, 90 yards dead ahead behind the fallen log. No time to think, only to move. Match. Draw. Release. The fifth arrow caught the log itself, which was drier than expected, and went up fast, flames licking across the position's cover and forcing 2 defenders into the open, where DeLuca's covering rifle fire finished what the arrow started. By the 6th position, 70 yards out and the closest target of the morning, Jesse's hands had gone from careful to automatic, each motion shaved down to its essentials the way a skilled man's motions always are under enough repetition. Match, draw, hold, release. The 6th arrow struck low against the cave mouth, and the fire rolled inward on its own draft, and the position stopped shooting almost before Jesse had knocked the seventh. Seventh position, 110 yards, tucked behind rubble from an earlier bombardment. This one took 2 adjustments, the wind shifting hard enough between breaths that Jesse held his aim a full beat longer than instinct wanted, watching a loose thread of smoke from the ridge to read the crosswind the way he used to read grass movement before a shot at a bedded deer. The arrow arced true, caught canvas camouflage netting first, and the fire spread from there into the position itself. 7 down. 8th position, 140 yards, upper crevice. That's your longest shot of the morning. It was. Jesse had never tested that range in low light with a crosswind gusting unevenly off open rock, and he knew it. He took an extra half-second, more than he'd allowed himself all morning, adjusting for elevation as much as distance, then lit the final arrow and drew until the string touched his jaw exactly where it always did. He released. The arrow rose higher than any of the previous 7, dropped in a long arc onto the crevice, and caught dry brush wedged into the cave mouth for camouflage. The flame rolled inward and did not stop until the position went completely silent, the same as the 7 before it. By 6:41 a.m., 37 minutes after the first contact, all 8 enemy positions on that stretch of ridge were burning, silent, or both. The platoon advanced without another shot fired against them. Jesse Tallbear had used 8 arrows to do what 2 flamethrower assaults and 11 dead or wounded men had not managed in 2 days of fighting. For a full minute after the last position went quiet, nobody moved. Jesse stood with an empty quiver and blistered fingers, watching smoke curl off the ridge he had just cleared. DeLuca looked at the bow, then at the 8 smoking positions, then back at Jesse, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of statement. Word moved through the platoon before the ridge was even fully secured. Men who had watched 2 previous assaults die on that exact ground walked the position afterward and found scorched rock, collapsed cave mouths, and 8 dead crews who had never fired a shot at anything but the arrows that killed them. Someone counted the burn marks. Someone else went looking for Jesse's discarded arrowheads, wire-bound and blackened, lying scattered across the slope like evidence at a crime scene nobody could quite believe. Jesse himself said little in those first minutes. He sat on a rock outcropping with his empty quiver across his knees, hands blistered from the bowstring, watching smoke rise off a ridge that had cost 2 previous assaults 11 casualties combined, and had cost this one exactly none. A corpsman who came through checking for wounded found nothing to treat and stood for a long moment, just looking at the 8 burn scars up and down the slope before moving on without a word. Within the hour, runners from 2 other platoons had made the climb up to see it for themselves, and by midday the ridge had unofficially become something soldiers walked out of their way to look at. The way men will detour past the site of something they don't quite believe happened even after they've seen the evidence. Staff Sergeant Pritchard reached the position within the hour, took one look at the melted wire and scorched cloth still clinging to a handful of unfired shafts in Jesse's pack, and asked the only question that mattered. "Tallbear, what exactly did you do?" It was not phrased as an accusation, not yet. It was closer to disbelief. Jesse explained plainly, fuel-soaked cloth, a bow he had carved himself, ranges no flamethrower could reach, and a doctrine that had already gotten 3 of his friends killed trying. Pritchard listened without interrupting, which from Pritchard was its own kind of alarm. By that afternoon, the report had climbed past platoon level. A captain arrived to view the ridge personally, counted 8 destroyed positions against 0 American casualties in that engagement, and ordered Jesse Tallbear to report to battalion headquarters the following morning. Nobody used the word court-martial out loud yet, but everybody understood it was sitting in the room. The proceedings, when they came, were less a trial than an interrogation dressed in procedure. Jesse stood before a review board of 3 officers, Major Thaddeus Whitlock presiding, and was asked to account for the unauthorized construction and combat use of an incendiary weapon outside standard Army ordnance. He answered without embellishment. He described the flamethrower failure rate his platoon had lived with for weeks. He named Rizzo, Novick, Larson, and Hansen, not as an appeal to sympathy, but as a plain statement of what the existing doctrine had already cost. He explained the fuel mixture, the fletching adjustments, the burn time testing, in the same flat technical language his father used describing a forge repair. An ordnance officer, Captain Everett Ashford, was brought in to examine the surviving unfired arrows. He tested the fuel mixture, measured the wire binding, and reported back to the board that the design, while crude and entirely improvised, was functionally sound and had clearly achieved combat effectiveness no standard-issue flamethrower on the island had matched that week. The debate that followed took most of 2 days. Some officers pushed for a formal reprimand, arguing that unauthorized ordnance modification, however successful, could not be permitted as precedent, and that a private who built his own incendiary weapon without authorization this time might build something far less controlled the next. Others pointed to the numbers on the table. 8 enemy positions destroyed, 0 American casualties in the engagement, against a flamethrower failure rate that had already cost the battalion 4 dead in the preceding 3 weeks alone. Major Whitlock reportedly asked the ordnance officer directly whether the technique could be formally adopted as issued equipment, fitted with standard arrowheads and factory-mixed fuel gel rather than a private's improvised mixture. Captain Ashford's answer was that it could in principle, but that doing so would take weeks the campaign didn't have, and that in the meantime the crude version sitting on the table had already outperformed standard doctrine in its only combat test. That answer, more than anything else said across 2 days of proceedings, settled the outcome. Major Whitlock's ruling, delivered on September 20th, split the difference in the way the Army often did. No court-martial, no punishment. Also no commendation, no medal, and no official record crediting Private Tallbear by name in any after-action summary distributed above battalion level. Instead, he was quietly reassigned to a 2-week rotation training other flamethrower teams in improvised incendiary techniques as a stopgap measure, while replacement ignition parts made their way through supply lines. It was not justice, exactly. It was survival dressed up as bureaucracy, and Jesse Tallbear, who had grown up understanding that poor men rarely got clean outcomes from powerful institutions, accepted it without complaint. What the official record did not capture and could not stop was how fast the technique spread once other units heard about it. By that evening, word had reached two neighboring companies through the kind of informal channel no officer controls. Men talking to men, describing what they'd seen on the ridge. By the next morning, 3 separate platoons had improvised their own fuel-soaked arrows using scavenged bows, machetes carved into makeshift bow staves, and in one case, a slingshot rigged with the same soaked cloth principle. Officers who might otherwise have discouraged it found themselves outpaced by results. Casualty reports from units using the improvised incendiary method over the following 2 weeks showed markedly fewer losses in cave-clearing operations compared to flamethrower-only assaults during the same stretch of the campaign, though official Army documentation credited the shift generically to improved incendiary employment techniques, rather than to any single soldier. Japanese defenders on Peleliu, already fighting a losing battle of attrition against superior numbers and firepower, began noting the change in their own reports. Intercepted radio traffic referenced unfamiliar American incendiary tactics reaching positions previously considered safe from flamethrower range, forcing some units to relocate firing positions deeper into cave systems, costing them time and coordination they could not spare. By evening of the first day, 2 neighboring companies had already sent men to examine the burned ridge for themselves. By the next morning, 3 separate platoons were experimenting with their own versions, some more crude than Jesse's, using whatever bow staves and scavenged wire they could put together in a few idle hours. By week's end, enough units had adopted some variant of the technique that battalion command, whatever reservations individual officers still carried, could not realistically have stopped its spread even if they had wanted to. Within a month, the ad hoc technique had folded quietly into broader improvisational doctrine used across the Pacific theater for the remainder of the war, credited in official histories, when credited at all, to field-expedient incendiary devices developed through General Troop initiative. Jesse Tallbear's name appeared nowhere in that language. Jesse survived Peleliu and the rest of the war, rotating home to Oklahoma in the spring of 1946 after a final stretch training incoming replacements in techniques the Army still declined to put his name to. He returned to Cherokee County, and within a year, took over his father's forge outside Tahlequah, shoeing horses and repairing farm equipment for the same kind of families who had raised him. He married a schoolteacher named Ruth 2 years later, and they raised 3 children on land that had belonged to his grandfather. He almost never spoke about the war. When his children asked, as children do, he would say only that he had done a job that needed doing and come home, and that was usually the end of the conversation. Every September, without ever explaining why to his family, he would disappear into the workshop alone for an afternoon, and nobody thought to connect it to a date on a calendar until long after he was gone. He kept one item from those years, a single unfired arrowhead, wire binding still intact, kept in a cigar box in his workshop that nobody outside the family ever saw while he was alive. Jesse Tallbear died in 1989 at age 66 of heart failure at the same farm outside Tahlequah where he had lived nearly his entire life. His obituary in the local paper mentioned 3 sentences about wartime service in the Pacific and nothing else. No mention of the Ridge. No mention of 8 positions burned in 37 minutes. No mention of a technique that had quietly saved lives across a campaign that claimed some of the highest American casualty rates of the entire Pacific War. It was not until 2011 that a military historian researching flamethrower failure rates on Peleliu came across a battalion after-action file referencing an unnamed soldier's improvised incendiary method, and following a trail of surviving veterans' letters and a handful of surviving unit rosters, connected it to Jesse Tallbear. An interview with his surviving daughter, along with the cigar-boxed arrowhead still sitting in the family workshop exactly where he had left it, confirmed what the official record never had. A rough calculation based on comparative casualty rates between flamethrower-only and mixed-method cave-clearing operations in the weeks following the Ridge assault suggested the technique may have contributed to sparing dozens of American lives across the remainder of the campaign, though no exact figure could ever be verified. The technique itself outlived the silence around its inventor. Elements of it echoed forward into post-war close-quarters incendiary doctrine, and decades later, military historians studying improvised weapons development in isolated combat conditions would point back to Peleliu as an early, uncredited case study in exactly the kind of bottom-up innovation no training manual ever anticipated. There was no war ever won by regulation alone. Doctrine gets written by men far from the fighting, and it gets broken, quietly and at great personal risk, by men close enough to see exactly where it fails. That is how war actually changes, not from the top down, but from a ridge line at dawn, from a farm boy's forge-trained hands, from a skill his grandfather taught him for reasons that had nothing to do with any army. Somewhere in Oklahoma, in a cigar box in a workshop that no longer stands, a single blackened arrowhead outlived the man who never once talked about what it had done. If this story moved you, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more forgotten history from the men who never asked for credit. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.